Richard Hartwell had everything money could buy, but he was about to discover that wealth couldn't purchase the one thing he needed most. What started as a test of loyalty would expose a betrayal so shocking it would destroy his world and rebuild it in ways he never imagined. The accident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in March. Richard was driving home from another grueling day at his investment firm when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into his Bentley. The impact sent Richard's car spinning into a concrete barrier at 60 miles per hour. When he woke up 3 days later in the hospital, his first thought wasn't about his broken ribs or the gash on his forehead. It was about the darkness. Complete, terrifying darkness where his vision should have been. Dr. Martinez delivered the devastating news with the kind of gentle authority that comes from years of shattering lives. Severe optic nerve damage. Likely permanent. Richard Hartwell, who had built a fortune through his ability to see opportunities others missed, would never see anything again. Or so everyone believed. The truth was more complex. Richard's vision was damaged, but not completely destroyed. He could make out shapes, movement, light and shadow. With time and the right treatment, Dr. Martinez privately told him, there was a 30% chance his sight could return to near normal levels. But as Richard lay in that hospital bed, listening to the hushed conversations outside his room, an idea began forming. A terrible, necessary idea. For 23 years of marriage, Richard had wondered. Wondered if Catherine loved him or his bank account. Wondered if his business partners saw him as a friend or a meal ticket. Wondered if his children visited because they cared or because they were protecting their inheritance. Now he had a chance to find out. Richard made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would let everyone believe he was completely blind. He would observe their behavior when they thought he couldn't see. He would discover who truly loved Richard Hartwell and who loved his money. The test began the moment he returned home to his 8-bedroom mansion in Westchester. Richard had practiced walking with a cane in the hospital, had learned to move like someone navigating total darkness. The performance had to be perfect. Catherine greeted him at the front door with what sounded like genuine concern. She guided him to his favorite armchair, brought him tea, spoke in the gentle tones she'd always used when he was sick. For a moment, Richard felt guilty about his deception. That guilt lasted exactly 48 hours. Richard was sitting in his study, supposedly reading Braille documents his secretary had prepared, when he heard Catherine's voice from the hallway. She was on the phone, speaking in hushed tones she thought he couldn't hear. "No, he can't see anything," she was saying. "The doctors confirmed it's permanent." "Yes, I know it's terrible, but James, this changes everything for us." Richard's blood turned to ice. James Mitchell. His business partner. His closest friend for 15 years. "I can't just leave him now," Catherine continued. "It would look heartless. But we need to be smart about this. Patient. Once the inheritance is settled and people stop watching so closely." The conversation continued, but Richard had stopped listening. Each word was a knife twisting in his chest. The woman he'd built his life around was planning to abandon him the moment it became socially acceptable. And she was planning to do it with his best friend. But the betrayals were just beginning. The next evening, Richard's daughter Emma came to visit. 25 years old, fresh out of law school, the pride of his life. Richard heard her heels clicking across the marble foyer, heard her kiss Catherine's cheek, heard them whisper together before Emma entered his study. "Daddy." Emma's voice was sugar-sweet, the way it had been when she was 7 and wanted a pony. "How are you feeling today?" They talked for 20 minutes about his recovery, her new job at a prestigious law firm, her boyfriend's proposal. Normal father-daughter conversation. Richard began to relax. Perhaps Emma, at least, truly cared. Then she left to use the bathroom, forgetting her purse on the side table next to Richard's chair. Her phone buzzed with a text message. The screen was bright enough that Richard, squinting through his damaged vision, could make out the words, "Dad seems completely helpless. Mom's right, now's the time to move the offshore accounts. He'll never know." Richard's heart shattered. His daughter, his brilliant, beautiful daughter whom he'd supported through college and law school, was actively helping to steal from him. Over the following weeks, Richard discovered the full scope of the conspiracy. His son Michael, who managed the family's real estate investments, was selling properties and pocketing the proceeds. His brother-in-law had been embezzling from the company for months. Even the housekeeper was stealing jewelry, confident that the blind man would never notice. But the cruelest betrayal came from James Mitchell. Richard had trusted James with everything: power of attorney, access to business accounts, decision-making authority while Richard recovered. James visited every day, sitting beside Richard's chair with apparent concern, discussing business decisions and asking for Richard's input on important matters. What James didn't know was that Richard could see well enough to notice the documents James brought were fake. The contracts were meaningless papers. The financial reports were fabricated. While pretending to include Richard in business decisions, James was actually dismantling everything Richard had built. The investment firm that had been Richard's life's work was being sold piece by piece. Client accounts were being transferred. The company Richard had spent 30 years building was disappearing, and everyone believed he was too blind and broken to realize it. Richard endured this torture for 3 months. 3 months of watching the people he loved most systematically destroy him. 3 months of pretending to be helpless while his world crumbled around him. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when Richard overheard Catherine making plans to move James into the house. "Richard spends most of his time sleeping anyway," she was saying. "He'll never know. And this way we can be together while still maintaining appearances." That evening, Richard made a phone call that would change everything. "Dr. Martinez," he said when the surgeon answered, "I think it's time for that experimental surgery we discussed." Richard had been secretly working with a different medical team, specialists who'd been developing his treatment plan while everyone believed his case was hopeless. The surgery was scheduled for the following week, with only Dr. Martinez and his team aware of Richard's true condition. But Richard had other plans brewing beyond medical treatment. He'd spent 3 months gathering evidence. Hidden cameras installed by a security company he'd hired without anyone's knowledge. Audio recordings of conversations. Financial documents proving the thefts. Screenshots of text messages between the conspirators. Richard Hartwell might have been playing blind, but he'd been seeing everything. The day before his surgery, Richard called a family meeting. He told everyone he wanted to update his will while he still felt mentally sharp. The whole family gathered in his study: Catherine, Emma, Michael, even James Mitchell. They all played their parts perfectly. Concerned wife, caring children, loyal business partner. Their performances were Oscar-worthy, filled with love and support for the blind patriarch making final arrangements. Richard waited until they were all seated, all comfortable in their deception, before he spoke. "I have something to tell you all," he began, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "Something I've learned during these past 3 months." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder of documents. With deliberate precision, he spread photographs across the desk. Screenshots of text messages, bank records, evidence of every betrayal, every theft, every lie. The silence that followed was deafening. "You see," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "the thing about being blind is that people assume you can't see what they're doing. They forget that vision isn't just about eyes." Catherine's face had gone white. Emma was staring at the documents like they might burst into flames. James had actually stood up, as if preparing to run. "I've been able to see enough this whole time," Richard said, finally making eye contact with each of them in turn. "Enough to watch my wife plan to abandon me for my best friend. Enough to see my children steal from me. Enough to watch my business partner destroy everything I built." The explosion of denials and excuses that followed was predictable. Catherine claimed she was lonely and scared. Emma insisted the offshore account transfers were to protect Richard's assets. Michael swore he was just keeping the real estate portfolio active. James simply stood there, caught like a deer in headlights. Richard listened to it all with the patience of someone who had spent 3 months preparing for this moment. "Here's what's going to happen," he said when the room finally fell silent again. "Catherine, you have 24 hours to move out. The divorce papers will be filed tomorrow morning. You'll get nothing beyond what the prenup specifies." Catherine started to protest, but Richard held up his hand. "Emma and Michael, You're both removed from my will effective immediately. Your trust funds are frozen. The money you've stolen will be repaid or you'll face criminal charges." His children looked stunned, as if they'd never considered there might be consequences for their actions. "James," Richard turned to his former business partner, "you have 48 hours to return control of my company and reverse every unauthorized transaction. If you don't, the FBI Financial Crimes Unit will be very interested in the evidence I've compiled." The room erupted again, but Richard was done listening to their excuses. "The only question now," he said, raising his voice above their protests, "is whether any of you have anything genuine to say. Any real explanation that doesn't involve greed or betrayal." The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. One by one, they left. No apologies. No admissions of guilt. Just anger at being caught and frustration that their plan had failed. Richard sat alone in his study as the house emptied around him. The weight of what he'd discovered should have crushed him, but instead, he felt something unexpected: relief. For 3 months, he'd lived with the terrible knowledge of their betrayal. Now, finally, he could stop pretending. Stop performing blindness. Stop pretending to trust people who saw him as nothing more than a source of money. The surgery the next day was successful beyond Dr. Martinez's wildest expectations. Richard's vision returned almost completely. Within a week, he could see clearly enough to drive. Within a month, his eyesight was better than it had been in years. But the real recovery took much longer. Richard rebuilt his business from scratch, cutting ties with everyone who had betrayed him. He discovered that loyalty was rarer than he'd thought, but more valuable than he'd imagined. The few employees and associates who had remained genuinely concerned about his welfare became the foundation of his new company. He never remarried, but he found something better than romance: authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. The divorce from Catherine was swift and decisive. She fought for a larger settlement, claiming the stress of caring for a blind husband entitled her to more than the prenup specified. The judge was not sympathetic when Richard's evidence was presented in court. Emma and Michael both tried to reconcile with their father over the years, but their apologies always seemed to coincide with their financial difficulties. Richard helped them when they truly needed it, but he never again confused financial support with parental love. James Mitchell's business empire collapsed within 6 months. The clients he'd stolen from Richard disappeared when they learned about his deception. He eventually moved to another state, but his reputation followed him. 5 years after his fake blindness experiment, Richard established a foundation dedicated to supporting genuinely disadvantaged individuals, people whose disabilities were real, whose struggles were authentic. The irony wasn't lost on him that pretending to be blind had taught him to truly see. The foundation's mission statement, written by Richard himself, read, "Sometimes we must lose everything we think we want to discover what we actually need." Richard never regretted his deception. The 3 months of fake blindness had been the most painful period of his life, but also the most valuable. He'd learned that love cannot be purchased, that trust must be earned, and that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we know the least. On quiet evenings, Richard sometimes wondered what would have happened if he'd announced his recovery immediately after the accident. Would Catherine have stayed loyal? Would his children have remained honest? Would James have continued being a true friend? He suspects the answer is yes, but he also knows those relationships would have been built on a foundation of ignorance rather than truth. By testing their loyalty when they thought he couldn't see their betrayal, he discovered who they really were beneath their loving masks. The accident that nearly cost Richard his sight had actually given him the clearest vision of his life. He'd learned to see past wealth and status to the character beneath. He'd discovered that being truly blind to someone's nature is far worse than any physical disability. Richard Hartwell's story serves as a reminder that sometimes the most generous thing we can do is stop giving people opportunities to disappoint us, and that the most loving thing we can do is see people exactly as they are, not as we wish they were. If this story made you think differently about loyalty, trust, and the people closest to you, share it with someone who values authenticity over comfort. Because sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that set us free.